Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, and I'm here today to do a mid-month book wrap-up for what I've read so far in the month of October. The first book I completed in the month of October was one that's been on my nightstand for quite a while, and that's World Without Fish by Mark Kurlansky. This is a sort of a middle grade non-fiction graphic novel that tells it's sort of a mixture of prose and graphic elements. See if I can find a nice picture here, like this one, which tells the story of the threats that face the world's oceans today, from climate change to pollution to overfishing, and tells it in a very straightforward manner that I think is highly appropriate for a middle grade audience. This was a little, I didn't find it informative. I knew all of the information that was in here, but I enjoyed the way that it was laid out. I thought it was very well done and would reach a lot of people who don't know much about the subject of oceans and threats to our oceans in today's world. So if you are interested in the topic and you sort of want a place to begin, I would say that this is a very good place to begin. Very fun and informative, quick read. The next thing I completed was an audiobook, and that's Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. And this is the first book, I believe, and it's going to be a trilogy. The second book is out, and the third book comes out pretty soon next year, I think. And it's science fiction, and it's about a young woman, Binti, who leaves her home on Earth. She's from a small community that's very insular. They keep to themselves, but she gets a scholarship to a university off-world, first person in her community to get a scholarship to this university, and she chooses to leave her home and travel to this distant place to go to school. And along the way she runs into adventure, and she has to deal with discrimination, and she has to deal with her own fears about leaving home. And actually, I believe it's a novella length, and on audio it's fantastic. I would highly recommend you consume it in that way if you like audiobooks, but in any case, definitely check out Binti by Nnedi Okorafor if you like science fiction reads. The next thing I completed was The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. This is the third book in the Stone Sky fantasy trilogy, so I can't talk very much about the actual plot points that happen in this book, but I will say that overall I absolutely love this fantasy series. I found it to be quite different than most fantasy series that I read, not in that sort of the tropes of fantasy are different, because there's a lot of similar, like our hero has to go on the road, and along the road they meet, they have a lot of adversity and it have adventures, and there's some evil that they have to right in the world. But what I found to be different and exciting about this series is the diversity of characters, and the sort of the part of the adversity that the world in this series faces has to do with geological issues. So in this world, most of the disasters are natural disasters, and they're caused by geologic issues such as earthquakes, and then earthquakes causing tsunamis and things like that. And that is certainly a very different aspect to fantasy I found. I've never read anything like it. And I would also say that N.K. Jemisin does not spoon feed you the story. She expects you to do some of the lifting here in this. And so in the first book, I was confused for a lot of the time, not really understanding how the characters fit together. But by the second book, things had come together, and by this third book, she's wrapping it all up very well. And I also appreciate how this series takes a look at what happens when you turn a group of people into the other, and sort of keep them separate from the rest of your society, what that does to those people who are considered the other, and what it also does to your culture and your society as a whole. Some excellent food for thought in this series. I highly recommend it. The next thing I completed was a book for the Read Harder Challenge for 2017, and that was to read a book of poetry in translation that is not about love. And for that, I had on my shelves Beowulf, been there for several years. I picked up this translation by Seamus Heaney, I think, Seamus Heaney. And this is a great version if you're interested in Beowulf, if you've never read it in school, which I didn't, because on the right side it has the Middle English, Old English poem, and then on the left side it has the current English translation. And I blew through this in one afternoon. This is epic poetry that tells the story of our hero Beowulf, and probably most of you know about Beowulf fighting the monster Grendel, which I had certainly heard of, but then Beowulf, this poem continues, and Beowulf meets other adversaries and has other adventures, and basically tells the story of his life. And this is also really great, has some notes in the margin, like here, where the translator kind of keeps you on track with what's happening in the action in the poem. So really a great experience reading this. Poetry is not my thing, but I did very much enjoy this epic translated poem. The next thing I completed was The Trouble with Goats and Sheep by Joanna Cannon. This has been all over BookTube. I don't probably need to talk about it too much, except to say this is a fiction book set in 1976 in England in a small neighborhood during a very bad heat wave. One of the women in the neighborhood, Mrs. Creasy, goes missing, and two 10-year-old girls, Grace and Tilly, start to investigate their neighbors to try to find out what's happened to Mrs. Creasy. And in the meantime, they start to uncover secrets from a decade ago that involved all the different people in this neighborhood. And this is a book that's about, judgment, tolerance, being kind to one another, forgiveness, and all the things that happen in a small neighborhood or in a small town when everybody knows one another, but people also assume a lot of things about each other. And this is a very heartwarming and charming sort of read, although some very nasty things happen. I mean, not nasty in like murder or anything like that, but like some nasty actions people take against one another. But I found it to be very just tugged at my heartstrings, and I very much enjoyed it. This is an excellent book. All the raves that have been going on about this book are absolutely warranted, I believe. The last thing I've finished so far this month, and will complete this wrap up for the first half of October, is a short story collection, Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is these stories are sort of realist fiction, having to do with relationships, fitting in, a lot of sort of immigrant type tales with folks coming from India or that area of the world to America, or things happening to folks in India. And it really does deal with, again, it gets into the questions, some of the similar questions that The Trouble with Goats and Sheep address with how do you fit in, what about if you're experiencing loneliness, even though you're in a relationship because you're not connecting with your partner, forgiveness. And I found this collection to be quite melancholy, I guess is the word I would use. There are pieces of each story that were humorous and would bring a smile to my face or give me a little chuckle. But in the end, when the story ended, I was left with a feeling of melancholy. And that tends to be my problem with short stories in general, is I find them just to give me a sense of sadness. I like them a lot of times. Like, I liked these stories, and I especially like the very last story in this collection. And I felt that story was actually the most hopeful story of the bunch. But it's hard to read short stories sometimes if you're not in the right mood for that sort of feeling of, just kind of sadness and melancholy. I think you can, it really does affect my enjoyment if I'm not in the right headspace to read short stories. So that's it for what I've read so far in October. I will be back hopefully before Friday with my autumn readathon TBR. That's my plan anyway. And in the meantime, I hope you are reading lots of great books, and I will talk to you later.